Thank you for joining our webinar on So You Think You Can Export, Exporting 101 Part 1. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Evan Buey, and I'm an International Initiatives Officer here at Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, working specifically on the export readiness and market intelligence file. Before we move into our feature presentation, I just want to give a quick snapshot of our programs and services and how we support Alberta agriculture companies. So I'm part of the International Market Development team, and we specialize in supporting Alberta agriculture, food and beverage companies to export to international markets. We help to facilitate workshops and training sessions such as today's, as well as generate market intelligence. We actually subscribe to a couple of databases and can find you a wealth of information on your products in relation to trends, price competitiveness, competitors, and more. We monitor market access issues and also help companies navigate free trade agreements. Our team is present at major agricultural trade shows around the world, where we build a strong presence by procuring a pavilion for our clients, and oftentimes partnering with other Canadian provinces to leverage the Canada brand. Typically, we try to add more value by coordinating additional programs around a trade show, which may include things like B2B meetings, market overviews, and store tours. The government of Alberta has 12 international offices abroad with dedicated ag officers at a number of them. We also work closely with the federal government through the Trade Commissioner Service to tap into their expertise, networks, and buyer connections to help companies enter those markets. So if you're looking for more information on this, please feel free to reach out. My contact information is on the screen there. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, as all the information is available online. But since this is a webinar on exporting, I just want to briefly highlight the CAP programs that apply to international market development and export readiness. So note that these aren't administered through my section, but another group. But the first one there, emerging opportunities, the purpose is to enable growth and diversification of Alberta's value-added industries through development and commercialization of new or emerging opportunities in the sector. Products to market, small projects. The purpose is to support growth of Alberta's agricultural industries by supporting the development of new products and or processes, commercialization of products in new markets, and expansion into local, domestic, and international markets. So this grant is for up to $50,000. There's actually two streams, Stream A being company-led initiatives, and Stream B being outbound trade initiatives led by my team. The last grant there, value-added products to market large project. So very similar to number 2 there, but this one has a grant minimum of $50,000 and a maximum of $500,000. Unfortunately, these are all closed right now, but I do encourage you to sign up for program notifications when they reopen sometime next fiscal year. So thanks again for joining us. I know there have been a ton of webinars lately, but I can guarantee this one will be great. I would now like to introduce our feature presenter, Christian Siviere with Solimpex. So following a 30-year career in international logistics in Europe and Canada, Christian started a Montreal-based import-export consultancy in 2010 called Solimpex, which is active in 2 main areas: consulting and coaching to help SMEs grow internationally, and training on the logistics, customs, and regulatory aspects of international trade, importing, exporting, free trade agreements, supply chain management, and related issues. Christian lectures for CIFFA, the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association in Toronto, and FIATA, the World Federation of Freight Forwarders in Zurich. He also gives seminars and webinars for various trade organizations and provides personalized training for importers and exporters. So with that, I'll pass it over to you, Christian. Take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Evan. And thank you for having me here. Thank you to Alberta Agriculture and Forestry for the invitation to present to this fine group that we have today to talk about Exporting 101, part one, and next week we have a part two coming up. So in part one is going to be focusing more on the initial steps and the marketing aspect, market research, free trade agreements, and how to benefit from free trade agreements. So this is the parts today, and next week we'll talk more about legal issues, logistics, and customs issues. So I don't need to introduce myself. Evan introduced me. Thank you very much for that, Evan. Why are we looking at exporting? What is so interesting about exporting? Is it that it's such a lucrative activity where we're going to make a lot of money? Well, hopefully, yes. Hopefully we will. Hopefully it'll be very profitable. But really, one of the reasons we need to export, and is vital for Canadian companies, for Alberta companies to export, is that we have a small home market. So Canada is small, the market is small, it's great in size and in quality, but it's small in population and in market size. And so we don't have the luxury of being, for example, in the US, where there's a huge domestic market. So for US companies, it's not as important to export as it is for Canadian companies. So, and so as a result, as soon as when we start having when we develop a successful product in Canada, in order to really go to the next step and really develop sales, we have to look at the export market because we're just too small. So briefly, those of you who were with us last week have already seen that slide, and if so, I'm sorry about that, but those of you who weren't with us, you might be interested to see where our trade figures have been going. Of course, the pandemic that we're experiencing since mid-March, has created a lot of misery, shall we say, on the economic front, because a lot of companies have had to close, have been in lockdown or in partial lockdown. So the economy has come to an almost stop, with the exception of essential services, with the exception of food, with the exception of medical. So our economy has suffered from the pandemic, and it was still in the process of emerging from it. I wanted to share with you our latest export figures, which shows that we have started to see a substantial rebound in June. And so these are the percentages on the increase of our imports and exports in June. So it's reassuring that after the May figures, which showed a kind of a stabilization of the situation, June really showed a pickup. We're still way behind last year by about 20%, but we're catching up. And I'm hoping that the July, we all have to hope that the July figures show a big rebound as well. So this is where our international trade is, including our exports at the moment. You know that our biggest export market is the US. It has been traditionally because of proximity, because of geography. We also have similar cultures, and our economies are also quite integrated in many areas, in manufacturing, automobile, energy, food, resources, etc., etc. Now, what's interesting is that our second market, if you look at this slide here, our second export market is China. If we look at it on an individual basis, if we look at the European Union as an entity, which it is, then we see that the EU is in fact our second export market after the US. And that share should grow probably for sure. Because of thanks to the free trade agreement we have with the European Union. So in case you're wondering, who is the biggest customer of the US? Maybe some of you are wondering, and you might be thinking that China is the biggest customer of the US, or maybe Mexico is, but in fact we are the best customer of the US. We are their first export destination, the first export destination for their services, as well as goods, products. So That's probably why they treat us so nicely, right? Particularly over the last few years. Now, let's be serious and let's talk about export and not about how the US treat us. That's not the topic today. So exporting, yes, is quite a noble cause. It's a necessity for us if we want to grow, if we want to expand and be successful. And so the first step is really to sit down and draw up an export plan. And so the export plan really is a way for us to take an inventory, basically, first of all, of where we are and what is our current situation, or what is our current status, and where we want to go and how we want to get there. And so the export plan really has to be done methodically so that we make an inventory of, first of all, what products, which are our successful products that we then want to export. And also, take an inventory of our resources, manpower, management, HR, production capability, what resources we have at our disposal, what outside resources we may have to draw from when we start exporting, because exporting is not something that you improvise, and it's also not something that you attack with a short-term agenda, a short-term objective. You go into the export market for the long haul, so you have to have adequate resources, not just financial, but also human, and production-wise, etc., etc. And so one of the things you do is you look at yourself, where you are, what you need to grow to take it from there. You look at what's around you as well. Who are your competitors, and what is the state of the industry that you're in? Is there a lot of activity? Is there a lot of growth? Are there a lot of changes? Are there fluctuating priorities in different markets, etc., etc.? So when we go to university or to business school, then we talk about the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. It's a nice way to say that indeed we want to figure out where we are and what does it need to go a step further. Where do we have to get additional resources, additional manpower, production, financing? What are the opportunities out there? And so we do that by doing a careful and a thorough analysis of the export market potentials that we know. And then, of course, the threats means that we look at what are the barriers, what are the pitfalls, what are the potential problems. So all this is basically has to be done in a structured way. There's different recipes to do that. There's different methods, but in the end, it's really to take an inventory of where we are, where we want to go, and what are the possibilities and what is the potential, as well as what are the barriers and potential pitfalls and potential issues that we're going to face that we will have to solve in the process. So designing our export plan, we talked about resources, we talked about how to acquire additional resources. A big component, of course, is the product development, that you want to have the right product to go overseas. You may have to adapt your product in many different ways. It can be with the product itself, or it can be with its packaging, its labeling, and as well as, of course, the language that you may have to use, or that you may have to become familiar with, and as well as adapting it to the local markets. If you are sending anything electrical outside of North America, it will be a different current, and there'll be different requirements in different countries. So you have to really, and to arrive at the right solution, you have to do an adequate and a thorough market research, looking at the potential of the markets that that you want to look into, that you want to attack, shall we say, and do a proper, eventually do a proper selection based on, yes, which are the most promising markets, which are the ones that require product development or adaptation that I will easily manage, or that I can manage with a reasonable cost and with a reasonable chance of success. And so beyond product development adaptation, the great element of success also is the marketing aspect. So you have to develop an international marketing plan. Marketing products domestically is not the same as marketing them internationally. And so this is where you'll have to look at how to not just adapt your product, but your marketing approach, and see also who you're going to develop your products with, or how you're going to develop your products in overseas markets or in international markets. Are you going to go direct, which is something that the modern means of communications and internet and e-commerce are a great enabler of dealing directly with customers. And that's not just true for B2C, it's also true for B2B. A lot of industrial customers buy things online nowadays. So that's an element to consider if you want to go direct. If you want to go direct to customers, that's on the other hand very demanding as far as regulations and as far as how to set up properly. It may require investments if you are going direct. So that might not be so easy initially. And so initially you may want to deal with an agent or a distributor, or maybe you'll have both. And then if you deal with a distributor, then you have to make sure that you use the right terms and references so that your distribution channel is set up the proper way as far as costs are concerned, as far as what do you expect from your distributor. Also, how do you get out of your distributor arrangement, of your distributorship or your distributor contract? Same with an agent. Having an agent is fine, is great, is very helpful, and in some markets it's compulsory. You just cannot work in some markets without an agent, but you want to be sure that agent does not become an employee at some point, or does not, that your relationship with that agent doesn't develop in such a way that he becomes too dependent on you, because that could have legal implications. So these are the things that we have to look at. Do we go direct to market? Do we have the means of doing that? And if we don't go direct, if we go through a distributor, through an agent, what are the legal implications? What are also the cost implications? And what are the legal boundaries or legal requirements that we should keep in mind, so that if we work with a partner and we select a partner and it works great, that's wonderful. But if for some reason it doesn't work well, and we want to change partner, then we have to be able to get out of our relationship smoothly and start with someone else. So these are things that we have to look into really at the initial stage, how we want to do that. And so developing an international marketing approach, as we said a moment ago, marketing our products internationally is different from marketing locally. You have to have also, we talked about resources a moment ago, internal resources. You have to have people who can develop that with you, who have expertise, experience in doing these things. It's not something that you can improvise. We'll look at some examples of that actually in a moment. Now, the other aspect, of course, is financial, because as we said a moment ago, exporting is not such an easy task. It's not such an easy, it's a great project, but you have to be in it for the long haul. You have to have the resources for that. You have to be patient also in developing overseas market. And that means that you have to have the resources. So you have to work on that, draw up a financial plan that will have steps, that will have milestones, that will have Also a review process so that you can examine, you can see in the process where you are at different milestones, and have you achieved what you wanted to achieve? Are you okay with the current resources, including financial resources, or are you going to have to go after for additional financial resources? These are the things you'll look at from a financial point of view. And of course, this is what I have put here is a bit, is sort of the classic way of looking at exporting. We want to have a travel budget. We want to have participate in trade missions. We want to participate in trade shows. In today's circumstances, that is kind of not possible. So we have to, I'm going on the assumption that this will be possible again soon, because that is what we all hope. Because it is really the best way to test the market and get information on overseas markets potential, find out who the competitors are, what are the price levels in these markets, what are the barriers. The best way to do that is to travel there, is to meet people, participate in a trade mission, go to a trade show, exhibit at a trade show. So in the meantime, until this is possible again, I think we can still work with the great tools that we have at our disposal with the internet. There are ways to participate in virtual trade shows. There are ways to reach people, to get a lot of information on potential markets, as well as to reach potential customers. I don't have to tell you about social media because you already know about it. So I guess the key today on the short term is to try to maximize the tool, adapt to our current environment. Let's hope that we can travel soon again, that we can exhibit to exhibitions again. But if we can't, for some reason, if this lasts, let's say for another 6 months, a year or two or whatever, we don't want to just wait and be like a sitting duck, just waiting for things to open up. We want to, of course, use the tools that we have. So let's go with the internet and all the resources that are available in order to achieve that, to reach clients and find out about what's happening in other markets, who our competitors are. There's so much information available on the web that it can be done. It's of course a bit more difficult to reach people because there's so much activity out there, but it's still possible. So trade shows, in closing that part of the presentation, what I wanted to say is that really, I'm really hoping that we can get into that activity again, because it's really the ideal way to find out what's going on in the market and what's going on overseas. Just visiting a trade show in the US will tell you a lot about what's happening in the US. Visiting a trade show in Germany will tell you a lot about what's happening everywhere around the world, because the biggest trade fairs in the world are in Germany. And you can meet so many people, you can see so many different products, you can get an idea of who is out there, who is the competition, who are the customers, what are the market trends. So it's really a wonderful tool to either visit a trade show or as a second step, exhibit at a trade show. But first I would visit it, and you get an awful lot of information from that. So we hope that comes back pretty soon. Why do we need an export plan? Of course, it's because it's a necessary exercise so that we know where we are and where we want to go. And if we don't plan properly, if we don't look at things correctly, then it's possible that we might fail because we haven't really looked into things thoroughly enough and look at particularly at the pitfalls, at the threats. But the other reason why we need an export plan is not just for us. It's also because, and Evan was mentioning was talking about the export assistance programs, for example. One of the first things that export development agencies or financial institutions will ask you is, if you need financing, if you need assistance, one of the first things they'll ask you is, okay, do you have an export plan? Show me your export plan so that I can assess the situation, and so I can see if I can support you. I can see if I can lend you money. For example, if you're looking at looking for financial assistance from banks or other financial institutions. So that's why an export plant is really important. Evan mentioned the Alberta offices that are overseas that are at your disposal. That's great to have these assets because they can direct you, they can get you local information, local market information. And I wanted to, on this slide, give you a broader perspective. So of course, the Alberta government can help us and is well positioned for that with these international offices, as well as with the great people like Evan and the other teams in Edmonton. But there's all kinds of other people who can help you and navigate through all that. And so one of them is the Trade Commissioner offices in Trade Commissioner services in Canadian embassies abroad from Global Affairs. And then you have other institutions that are interesting for you that can potentially help you. One of them is EDC. BDC is also involved in assisting SMEs export. So that's as far as government agencies, organizations. What I want to draw your attention to is that there's also a lot of trade associations that can be helpful. So I just put a few on the screen, just for as an example. If you're in the aerospace industry, if you're manufacturing aircraft parts of any sort or tools, then there's the Aerospace Industry Association of Canada that can either help you directly or that at least has a lot of information on his website. If you're in food, you probably know about the Canadian Food Exporters Association. If you're in the automobile industry, you know of the Association of Parts Automobile Parts of Canada. So all kinds of trade associations exist and can either help you directly or give you a lot of information. Some of them, you'll be surprised, some of them, if you look up on their website, they have sometimes market studies on some countries. And the other group of potential partners who can help you, I wanted to draw your attention to, is foreign chambers of commerce. For example, if you're interested in Europe, there is an organization called the European Chamber of Commerce in Canada. They're headquartered in Toronto. But they also have a Western Canadian office. You have AmCham, the American Chamber of Commerce in Canada. They are present all across Canada. So they might be interesting resources that can help you get more information on the potential of this market or that market overseas or in the States, and who the players are, who are the main distributors of this product or that product. And so on and so forth. So that's what I wanted to share with you on that front. And so in the next couple of slides, what I wanted to pinpoint was to say that, of course, we want to do thorough market research to find out where is there a potential for my product, which are the most promising markets. And of course, we hope that there's a market for our products in the US because they're so close to us, and it's the easiest export market to go to. However, what I want to mention here in this slide is that we can't, these overseas markets, the US, but also other markets, they are much bigger than us. So they're either much further or they're much bigger, and there's some difficulties or there's a complexity in some of these markets. And so I would say for the US, the challenge is to decide which part of the US will I go to, because we can't just attack the whole US market in one shot. It's just impossible. It's just too big geographically and as well as population-wise. Each region also has its particularities, has its specifics. And so it's really for us a question of selecting the right one where we're going to begin and then expand from there. So do we go to Montana because it's the closest, or do we go to California because it's kind of the most open one? And then from there, we might build into the Midwest, or we might go into New England, who knows? So really, carefully selecting the beginning of our path is important. The US is not one market, it's several regional markets. And it's important, I think, to select the right entry points so we don't burn ourselves and so we don't try to catch too big a market at one time. Same could be said with the EU, the European Union. What's different there is that it's a much more diverse market. So the US, what's neat with the US is that even though they each are regional markets, there's a northwest, a northeast, the southwest, the southeast. But in the EU, you also have geography, you also have the northern countries, the southern countries, but you also have these countries are very diverse in culture, in language. So if you want to attack, or if you decide that you want to attack the European Union market, which is, I think, should be our priority market after the US, then it's important to select which one you're going to go after first. You can't go after the German market and the Spanish market and the Italian market and the Nordic markets at the same time. It's just impossible because it will be just too complicated. So carefully select your entry point, which one to go after. And so with the EU, of course, the particular point is that the UK is leaving the EU at the end of the year, so it will be a separate entity. But nevertheless, carefully decide, carefully choose your market of entry or of first approach, and then expand from there. What's neat is in the EU is that once you selected there, once you're established there, it's relatively easy to grow because it's a customs union. So there's no customs formalities between these countries. So once your products are in one of the countries, they can you have freedom of movement in all the others. So it's an interesting market. Asia and the Pacific countries this is different. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is very different because it's very spread out. So it's an interesting trade agreement that opens a lot of doors, a lot of opportunities for our companies, but we don't have. It's not the same as approaching the US market or approaching the EU market. They are very diverse markets. Japan, Australia, Singapore. So you really have to treat them individually. So just to draw attention to how it's important to carefully choose the market that we're going to approach first. There's opportunities in the BRICS, the famous BRIC countries. I think, however, that they all have their issues right now. Russia is under partial sanctions. China, we have a bit of a problem with China. It's more political than anything else. India, I guess, is probably one of the most open countries out of these. Brazil is a country that's very protectionist. So there's opportunities there, but they are not necessarily easy countries to get into. Much more complex than going into the US or going into Europe. But on the other hand, there is potential there for sure. One aspect to take in consideration when you start exporting is you don't want to get tangled up in a situation that there's going to be some corruption involved or some hints of corruption and whatnot. This is something that is being watched more and more. There's several pieces of legislation that have been passed on that. There's one powerful legislation in the US. So it's something we should be aware of when we select the markets that we're going to go into. So we looked at geography, we looked at different parts of the world. So what I wanted to, a couple of things I wanted to share with you right now was about international marketing. We touched on that a moment ago. We discussed briefly product adaptation and product development, also new products for international markets. So international marketing is something we have to take seriously. We really have to look at the particulars of each market, cultural differences, ways of doing business, ways of dealing with people. If you go on a business trip to the US, it's relatively easy. People are relatively straightforward. I think it'd be the same in Germany. They're fast decision makers. If you bring a good case, a good product, competitive, it's reliable, Germans will decide relatively quickly. In France, in Italy, in Spain, you have to have a different approach. If you take a potential customer for lunch, you can't talk business right away. You have to leave that for the end of the meal. In Asia, there's different codes depending on the country you're dealing with. So you have to become very much aware of all these differences so that you don't burn your opportunities by using the wrong approach in all these different markets. So one of a famous case as discussed in marketing school, that's highlighted in marketing schools, is this one here of Coca-Cola that had an advertising campaign a few years ago in Arabic countries. And so for us, we're tired, we're lying on the sand dunes, we drink Coca-Cola, and then we're in fine shape afterwards. However, in Arabic countries where you read from right to left, the message is the opposite. You're in fine form, you're jogging, you drink Coca-Cola, and then you collapse. So it's just one of these examples of how international marketing can go wrong, how you have to be very selective, very careful on names, on brands, on advertising campaigns, promotional campaigns, etc., etc. One that was quite famous also a few years ago was Nova, the GM car that I think doesn't exist anymore. So it's a pretty old example, but it's a good one. I like it because if you go in Latin markets, Nova basically means it doesn't work. So it's not a great name to market in Latin American countries. It's a bit as if Toyota was going to name its next vehicle the Lemon, and then so would we like to buy a lemon? So maybe in Japanese culture, a lemon is something very good, it's a plus on the marketing point of view. But for us, a lemon is not a good car. There's funny examples in different places, different parts of the world. One I like to use also is in West Africa, because I've been there, and there's this brand of beer that was marketed by a German company called the Eku. And in the local language of Ghana and Togo, Eku means death. So it wasn't such a great name for those specific markets. And of course, I don't have to remind you, you all know about this, right? About the Alberta beer that inadvertently used a name that was inappropriate on Maori language. But these things, of course, nowadays take a different dimension because before the internet, before social media, these things would never get known, because the company in Alberta that makes that beer is probably never going to send any to the Pacific Islands. So nobody in Maori land would know about that. But with social media today, these things come out and they're all over the place in a very short time. So that's also something to keep in mind for our international approach. We have to use the tools at our disposal, but we have to be careful with them. Adapt to foreign cultures or keep foreign cultures in mind. For example, if you're going to China, you want to try to attack the Chinese market, you have to be conscious of the value of numbers. There's numbers that are good, bring fortune, and numbers that are considered bad luck. So luckily for Chanel number 5 is a neutral name in China. But can you imagine if they had called it Chanel number 4? Number 4 is a bad number in China. So that's the kind of things we have to be conscious of, and so do a bit of research on that and go carefully. Pricing strategy. It's nice to have these different models. Your pricing strategy will also depend on whether you use a distributor or not, or whether you go through an agent, or whether you go direct. And in the end, your pricing strategy will also depend on the market and be dictated by the market. So that's basically what I wanted to say on that. it's fine to say that there's a strategy, but the market basically dictates in a way. So what are the barriers to entry into export markets? Let's touch on that a little bit. So we refer sometimes to tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers. So let's just define them a little bit. I mean, it might seem obvious, but on the other hand, maybe it's not obvious to everyone. So a tariff barrier, I mean, basically is the duties, the customs duties that you pay, or that your product pays when it comes into the country, into the foreign country. So the solution to that, of course, is that thankfully we have free trade agreements with quite a few countries, and so our products then benefit from the advantages of the free trade agreements, and for the most part pay 0% duty, zero tariffs. So that is very helpful, of course. And so, as you know, we have the North America Free Trade Agreement that links us with the US and Mexico, has been in effect since 1994. And on July 1st, we transitioned to CUSMA, the revamped NAFTA 2.0. And so that's a great tool, of course, to sell our products in the US and in Mexico. We have the CETA Free Trade Agreement with the European Union since September 2017. And since December 2018, we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership with countries in the Pacific, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, etc. We have several free trade agreements also with smaller countries. So these three huge trade agreements put us in a good position, in a unique position, because we have access to these three huge markets. On top of that, I don't have a slide of that, but on top of that, we have free trade agreements with smaller countries like Chile, Peru, Israel, Jordan, Panama, Costa Rica, Colombia, Korea, Switzerland, etc. So we have a lot of free trade agreements. So let's take advantage of them as much as possible because they are great tools to expand and to get into new markets. Now, what are the benefits of free trade agreements and how do they work? So I want to touch on that a little bit because, well, I'll show you why in a moment. First of all, yes, the main benefit, 0% or on most products, zero customs duties or tariffs as we call them. Now, depending on the trade agreement, there's also other aspects that are interesting. The customs facilitation is one of them, but the one that's even more important is the opening of government procurement. And so it's quite interesting with Europe for the CETA trade agreement, a bit less interesting with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So each agreement has its own terms and conditions, and some might have more in it than others. But in many cases, we find some of these advantages as well, really depending on the agreement itself. And so to go back to the advantage for products, which is the lowering of customs duties, lowering of tariffs, I want to spend a few minutes on that to explain to you about rules of origin. So rules of origin, they're based on the country of origin or the country of manufacture of a product, of a good, and they're also good, which is normal, that goes without saying, but they're also based on something called the regional value content and the so-called tariff shift. And so they have these components, regional value contents and tariff shift, which sometimes are not always understood or well understood by companies. So I'm going to explain them to you briefly in a moment. And then because we want to have the ability to have a certain percentage of foreign content in our products, because with globalization, any manufactured product that you can think of will have some foreign content. So because we want to still be able to sell these products and benefit from the free trade agreement, we have developed what's called product-specific rules of origin. And I'll explain to you how these work. And then we also have this origin certification process that we must master, that we must know and get to know when we start exporting. We have to know about these things. So I said 0% duties on most products, or on a lot of products, but of course, as always, there's exceptions. So I'm going to show you, for example, the exception on beef products in Japan under the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Japanese customs duties or tariff on beef is not going down to 0%. Is being phased in over several years, or phased out, sorry. But it never goes to 0%. In fact, in year 16, which will be in 14 years from now, it's going to be at 9%. It's going to be at 9%, and it's going to stay at 9%. So it's something to keep in mind. There's exceptions, and not all products go down to 0%. Some stay with a tariff, with a duty. And then, of course, there's, in the context of free trade agreements, there's quotas, which are maximum quantities that we can send free of duty, and these are phased in, usually phased in over several years. For example, the CETA quotas are phased in over 6 years. So we're in year 3 of these quotas. So it's just to give you a feeling for how they work. For some products, there are certain restrictions, and so that's what they are. Now, the reason I want to talk to you about free trade agreements is and the rules of origin, and explain to you how they work, is as follows. As you see on this slide, there's been a survey done by Thomson Reuters and KPMG. It's a few years ago already, but it was a really interesting one. It talked about the utilization rate of free trade agreements. And basically there it said the outcome was that 70% of companies don't utilize free trade agreements to the fullest, or as much as they should, or as much as they could. And out of these 70%, if you see at the bottom left-hand side, 79% don't utilize trade agreement fully because they find the rules of origin too complicated and they have a hard time coping with them. So that's why I want to explain to you how rules of origin work, to give you a better feeling for what it is and what you have to look for, and in a nutshell, to show you that they're not that complicated in the end. So there's a Reuters KPMG survey. Global Affairs also have a similar survey. Japan did surveys of exporters also, and same thing in Japan. Only a certain percentage of companies fully benefit from free trade agreements because they find the requirements too complex. So that's why I want to show you the two main components, major components of free trade agreements. First of all, the regional value content. So the regional value content, and I use an example of a Canadian-made product here, which I happen to know well, and I happen to know that the company that makes that in Quebec, BRP, has European content because the engines are made in Austria, and there's some US content, and there's some Mexican content, etc. And so the way it works in the context of a free trade agreement is that you don't just consider the Canadian content to find out or to figure out if your product qualifies. You also add the foreign content, or the content from the other countries that are in the free trade agreement. So for example, if you wanted to sell this Sea-Doo in the US, you would take the Canadian content and the US content and the Mexican content, if there is some, and then you would add all that, and that would give you your percentage of regional value content. So that's the thing to keep in mind. It's not just the Canadian content that counts, it's the regional content. And so if you were exporting that Sea-Doo to Spain in Europe, in the European Union, then you can't add the US content anymore, you can't add the Mexican content anymore, but you could add the Austrian content, you can add any European content. So you'd add your Canadian content and your European content, and that gives you your percentage of regional value content. If you're exporting to TPP countries, you could take the Canadian content and the Vietnam content, because Vietnam is part of the TPP. So that's the first component, and it's important to realize that we can have foreign components, but we can't have too much. There's the percentages that we have to have, and the percentages of local content is not just Canadian content, but also content from the other countries that are part of the specific trade agreement. How you calculate that, how you prove that to customs, Afterwards, if they want to do, if they do an audit, is you build your bill of materials with where you itemize all your supplies and their origin, their value, where they come from, and you get to your percentages. And you have to maintain that, of course, in case there's an audit. And then the other element is the tariff shift. So a tariff shift refers to the fact that when you manufacture a product, when you can have foreign input, foreign raw materials, parts, and components, and when you use that to manufacture a different product, your output will be different from your input, then that is possible. Your input can be foreign as long as your product is transformed enough, is manufactured enough, and becomes a different product. So one of the examples I enjoy using is this one. You could be importing cocoa beans in Alberta and then make a chocolate bar, and then you could export your chocolate bar, and it would qualify under most free trade agreements, because even though the cocoa bean is not Canadian, it's you most likely bring it from Africa, but you transform the product enough. A bar of chocolate is not the same thing as cocoa beans. And so that's what the tariff shift refers to. It refers to a change in the HS code, in the customs tariff number, that results in the manufacturing process, in transforming a product. Another example, if you're in the aluminium industry, then aluminium is made from bauxite, and bauxite isn't mined in Canada, it's mined in Africa and in Indonesia and other countries, exotic countries. And so your HS code, your tariff code for bauxite is different from the HS code of aluminium products, the aluminium that you're going to produce. And so that is, in effect, a tariff shift, a change in HS code. And this is how free trade agreements work. So you can have foreign content in some cases, as long as you have a transformation of the product, of the finished product itself. So that takes us to rules of origin, and they look like this, and they look very complex, but that's because they refer to the HS code of products. So wherever you see a reference to a subheading, a heading, a chapter, that refers to the numbering system of the finished product and the numbering system of the input of raw materials, components, and parts. And then the last element on that is the percentages. Remember, I talked about percentages, regional value content. So there, why it looks complicated for some people if you're not well informed or informed enough, is that you often have different percentages. So here, the percentages are 60% and 50%, and they talk about the transaction value and the net cost. So what does that mean? In reality, it's very simple. It means that you, the exporter, can decide if you want to do the calculation based on the sales price. The transaction value method refers to sales price. Or do you want to base your calculation on the net cost, on the cost of making the product? And so that's all it means. And you have the choice. You don't have to meet both percentages. You can all you need to meet is one of them, and that's it. You're good. So I'm sorry. I hope it was not too long. I'm sorry if it was a bit complex, but or perhaps complicated for some of you. But that really is important if you're going to export. If you want to export, get familiar with these rules so that you understand what the various parameters are and what you can do, and where you can source your inputs without jeopardizing the admissibility of your outputs towards a free trade agreement or the other. So these are important things to look into, become familiar with, so you can take informed decisions on the markets that you're going to tackle, as well as your sources of supply. And just to finish on that, I want to show you, I explained to you how these rules of origin work in free trade agreements, and I want to tell you how they are, the reason some people find them complicated is because each trade agreement will be structured the same way, but it will have slightly different rules. So this is the rule for cookies. If you're baking chocolate chip cookies and you want to sell them in the US, the NAFTA rule of origin or the CUSMA rule of origin is very simple. You just need to have a tariff shift. That's all. So you could import the flour from Europe and the cocoa beans from Africa, the sugar from Brazil, the salt from Spain, because they're in a different HS code, in a different tariff code as the cookies, as the pastries, then you don't even have to, they don't have to be Canadian in any way. As long as you have transformed the product, as long as you have baked the cookie in Canada, basically is what it boils down to, you're good. And that's the only requirement under CUSMA, our new NAFTA. Very simple, very easy. The same product in CETA with the European Union is much more complicated because you cannot have more than certain percentages of sugar, dairy products, rice, etc., etc. And so it's just to give you a feeling for why some people find that complicated, is because each trade agreement will have the same principles, but will have different details in the rules of origin. So we have to be careful. It's not because your cookie qualifies for NAFTA that it qualifies for CETA. Last element, the origin certification, it refers to the fact that the exporter has to produce an origin certificate to basically attest that this product meets the rules of origin of the free trade agreement. So that's a legally binding document. We have to be sure when we sign it, we have to be sure that we do meet the rules. Otherwise, that could be problematic, that could bring us penalties down the road. So again, just like each trade agreement has different rules of origin, they can have different percentages, they can be easy, they can be difficult sometimes, it really depends. Each trade agreement also has a specific document, a specific certificate of origin. So the NAFTA certificate for NAFTA or CUSMA, and then the Korea certificate for Korea, and so on and so forth. The other rule that free trade agreements have is about direct shipments. We don't need to spend too much time on that. Basically, it makes sense. You have to ship your goods directly to the country, to the destination country. There's exceptions. If the goods stay under customs control, if the goods stay in bond, they could go to the destination country indirectly, but that's not a huge deal. And my last slide on free trade agreements before we conclude is about the utilization rate of CETA, which, and so why I show that, why I want to show that to you is that I found that out just 2 weeks ago. That study just came out from Global Affairs 2 weeks ago. And if any of you are interested, I can send it to you. Just drop me a line, send me an email. I can send you that complete study that talks about Canadian trade, international trade. I found the part on CETA interesting because it's basically, it says that only about half of Canadian companies fully benefit, or half of the Canadian companies that deal with Europe take advantage of the free trade agreement. So that means that there's still a lot to be done and to get more familiar with the CETA agreement. And I thought that was an interesting information to share with you. It was surprising, really surprising to me. So we talked about trade tariffs, tariff barriers. So that's basically the way around that, so to speak, is free trade agreements. Thanks to free trade agreements, we pay 0% tariff on most products, or our products pay 0% tariffs in these countries. So they get a competitive advantage. There's non-tariff barriers. So what do we call non-tariff barriers? Well, that's because sometimes countries have complex regulations, have restrictions on imports. They can have quotas. They can have specific and cumbersome documentary requirements. They can have also, we need to meet the standards of those countries. So that could be, sometimes it can be problematic, or let's say it's something that we really have to research thoroughly before we want to approach this or that export market. What are the standards that we have to meet? What are the rules and regulations in that country for my type of product? And so for non-tariff barriers in general, we have the World Trade Organization that is dealing with these issues, and that is it's an organization that is very helpful, very important, but it's a bit stalled right now because of the U.S. policies. So that's another topic. I just wanted to show you a few of these barriers, or these things that can happen when we export. A few years back, we had this threat of the cool regulations in the US about meat labeling. Luckily, after Canada complained at the World Trade Organization, the US pulled that legislation, but these are things that happen once in a while, or that can happen in export markets. I don't have to tell you, because I'm sure you heard about it, about the new tariffs on Canadian aluminium that Trump has decided to impose. So these things happen sometimes in international markets. They're happening more and more with this current administration. So we hope that things get better in November. I won't say too much more about that. An example that's kind of interesting is Algeria last year, or I think it was last year, decided to ban imports of all kinds of products, including a lot of foodstuffs. So we are sometimes faced with these issues that this country or that country, for one reason or another, makes it difficult to sell there or to export there. Algeria is one. Saudi Arabia, of course, because of the diplomatic role with the Saudis, it's still a bit difficult sometimes. I don't have to remind you about China, because I'm sure you know about it. But we have issues with India sometimes. We have issues with Pakistan. Pakistan, a couple of years ago, had decided that they wanted to make it more difficult. They did not want to accept Canadian inspection standards, if I recall. And then you have India, who decided to all of a sudden put import duties on pulse, on peas and beans. So these things happen once in a while. Unfortunately, it's part of the risks of international trade. These non-tariff barriers, regulations, or changes in regulations, they can happen sometimes. They happen sometimes, and they are not easy to deal with. I think it just happens to be part of the game, part of the risks involved in doing business internationally. If we don't want to have these risks, then we just sell locally and we can't grow because our market is small. How important is exports for Canadian businesses? Well, there you go. Exports represent 32%, almost a third of our GDP. So that underlines that. And so in closing, and that introduces the topic for next week, in closing, as an exporter, our main responsibility obviously is to deliver the merchandise, hand over the merchandise as per the contract, as far as quantity and quality, according to the Incoterm that has been agreed between the parties, and that will be one of the topics next week. We'll touch briefly on Incoterms. It's an important element of international trade. Our other responsibility as an exporter is to transfer the ownership to the buyer at some point, and also to hand over the documentation pertaining to the goods. The main responsibility of the buyer, obviously, is to pay for the merchandise, but also to take delivery of the merchandise. I mean, that's an important aspect. It's part of the contractual obligation. If you supply the goods in good condition, as per the contract, in quantity and quality, then the buyer has to accept to take delivery. He can't say, well, I'm not going to accept to take delivery. So that's part of the broad responsibilities. And so why I wanted to touch on that is because that's what we're going to talk about next week: legal aspects, Incoterms, international payments, logistics also. So there we'll talk about international freight forwarders and customs brokers and how they can help us navigate through all these issues. The sales contract, insurance contracts, risk management, international payment, that's on the menu for next week, where we hope we're going to find many of you again. That brings me to the end of today's presentation. And I'm going to be really happy to have a dialogue with you now and engage in our Q&A and answer any questions that you may have had. And so Thank you for your attention. I hope it's been interesting and informative, and I'll hand over the microphone back to Evan so that we can have good exchanges. And so for that, yes, I think the way to do this really is to put your questions in the chat area. And Evan, I think, has a few words to say also.
Yes, thank you so much, Christian, for the informative webinar there. I learned a lot, and I think it was a great kind of glimpse into exporting 101, and I like how, you left people wanting more there with part 2 next week. So please, everyone, make sure you register for that and tune in as well. So just, I guess before we get into our Q&A here, give you some time to think about some questions just to let you know about the upcoming webinars here. So we already mentioned part 2 is next week. And then we have a couple more timely webinars here in the coming months. So these sessions, they can be found on Eventbrite, but you can also just reach out to me and I'll send you the information too. Okay, so with that, we'll get right into questions. Again, just use the chat box if you've got any. But I've got a couple here that rolled in during the presentation for you, Christian, to get us started. Yep. I'll just turn off my screen. Okay, so the first question here, what are the biggest mistakes you see new exporters making?
I think, well, one of the biggest mistakes really is to not have taken the time to look at the barriers and at the regulations and focus rightly on the market, focus rightly on customers, but not realizing that there's other aspects, meeting up with standards or coming up with the right documentation, and then or not having evaluated properly the cost, the cost of tariffs, for example, duties, taxes, et cetera, and then ending up being more expensive. The whole business, the whole enterprise, the whole exercise ends up being more costly. You have a higher cost than you anticipated, and you can't recover them because you agreed with the client at the beginning to for example, take a lot of the costs, and depending on the Incoterm that you use. So I find what some people don't underestimate is figuring out their costs, their responsibilities in terms of logistics, customs, and regulations, and focus exclusively on developing the right product and finding the right client. So that's what I find often happens.
Okay, great.
Or sometimes. I shouldn't say often, I should say sometimes.
Right. Everyone's unique. Another question here. What is your opinion on JVs as an entry strategy?
Well, then, yeah, JVs is great. I mean, if you, it's in a way you could say it's like having a license arrangement. So yeah, a joint venture is going to help you because you're going to have a local partner who is going to be as interested as you in the success of the venture. He's going to take the risks or part of the risks. Unfortunately, he's also going to take part of the profits when things work. So I think it's a great way to enter a market. And perhaps it's a great way in markets that are harder to get into. But in markets that are easier to get into, I think you may not want to be tied with someone. You may want to do it on your own, sort of. But yeah, a great way in some markets, a great way to get into new markets where you need a lot of local expertise, local contacts, and so on.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I have a product to export that is made in Canada. Whom do I seek assistance to create an effective export plan for exporting in the US?
I think that you have great teams with the Alberta government that can steer you in the right direction to do your export plan. and that should be the first step. And I think also um, your financial institutions or EDC can assist, BDC can assist, or you look for an international trade consultant somebody who has experience in these markets and who can help you with that. There's really many different ways to do that.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned a couple of the organizations that can assist as well in one of your slides. If the person that asked that question is located in Alberta, I'm just going to give out an example here, Christian, of an organization. So Edmonton Global and Calgary Economic Development, they both have a trade accelerator program, which is
great.
Highly recommended.
Yeah, it's a trade accelerator. Yeah, I forgot about that, Evan. Good point. Yeah, we have this trade accelerator program that is an excellent way to do that. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I see that they're from British Columbia, but yeah, BC absolutely has one.
Yes.
Another question here. How do I know which free trade agreement to use if Canada has more than one agreement in place with my target market?
Well, we don't usually have, we usually have unique trade agreements, like we have one with the US and Mexico. So you'd use the provisions of that if you want to go into the US or Mexican market. And if you're looking at Europe, then you'd look at the CETA agreement with Western European countries, with the exception of Switzerland, for example, because Switzerland is not part of the European Union. So there, we have a free trade agreement with Switzerland that's called the CEFTA agreement, Canada European Free Trade Association agreement. So really, each free trade agreement is unique and only covers specific countries. So you have to go to the different trade agreements really individually. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. But we don't usually have free trade agreements. We don't have two trade agreements with the US or with Europe. We only have one. So there isn't a question of choosing, really.
Okay, thank you, Christian.
Unless I misunderstood your question.
I think that was all right. There might be a couple of trade agreements.
Yes, I mean, if you
South America that have the odd.
Yes, so you have for example, we have a free trade agreement with Chile, and Chile is also part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership.
Right.
But they haven't ratified it yet. They haven't implemented yet in Chile, nor in Peru. And as far as I know, you could use the one that's most advantageous to you. And it works the same way in Canada. If you're importing products from, let's say Mexico is a good example actually, because Mexico has ratified. We have CUSMA with Mexico. We also have the TPP. Mexico is part of the TPP. And as far as I know, when you're inbound into Canada, you can use the one that best suits you. So I would presume it's the same outbound.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, it looks like that was the last question. If there's no further questions, we can wrap things up for today. Oh, we got one more here. What's the best way to do market research?
Well, so it's a really wide open question. I mean, the best way to do market research is to look at all the tools that are available, to get as much information on that market. So it really depends on the market itself. I guess the important thing is to be able to get reliable information on what the potential of that market is and what the potential is for the type of product that you're going to try to sell there. And are there any barriers to entry? And what is the status of the competition? Is the product that you're going to sell or want to sell, is there a lot of competition for it? What are the price levels? So to get all that information really is depends on the market involved, and it's important to try to get as accurate as much primary information as you can, or secondary information is good as well, and get as much of it as possible and get it as accurate, as reliable as possible. I think there, the people who can guide you would be the Alberta offices overseas, as well as the trade commissioners overseas. So they'll be able to point you to local market information.
Yes, and kind of like my introduction slide there. We at Alberta Agriculture, we have kind of databases available where we can pull up some of that information for you. And I know if you're located in British Columbia, the BC government, they also subscribe to a number of databases too, and that's all free.
Absolutely. There's a lot of information out there. Really, it's a question sometimes of choosing it or selecting it, and also make sure it's reliable. But there's a lot of free information out there, and sometimes, you know, you have to pay for information. There are some companies, private companies, that sell market information. I mean, as long as they're reliable companies and well established, I mean, that should be okay.
Another question for you, Christian.
Yes.
Should companies choose one export market to begin with? And then a follow-up, does selecting more than one market dilute focus?
Yeah, I think yes. When you start exporting, I think it's wise to start with one market and as a kind of a test, and then expand gradually into other markets that are relatively similar, and then grow from it. I think it depends, of course, on the size of your company, and it depends on the resources that you have and the type of product. But I think it's generally wise to start with one or maybe two, because maybe the one you start with is not going to work. So you know, you may want to start with two markets, but not too many markets at the same time, because indeed you lose focus, or you won't be able to devote as much time as is necessary on one market, and you might not be successful because of that. Yes, absolutely. So focus, yes, is important, and limit the scope a little bit at the beginning. I know sometimes we don't want to do that. We want to go all the way, but I think it's wise to get experience first, and if possible, start with an easy one. I mean, I've seen companies that want to are all excited. Companies that have never exported before, who wants to go into the China market, for example, because they heard that there is so much potential. I don't think, for most cases, I think it's not the right thing to do. I think you have to start with an easier market, get experience, and then go into more demanding or more risky markets. That's how I would do it.
Okay, great advice. I'll maybe just wait a couple more seconds here and see if any other questions roll in.
Sure, absolutely. Yes, we have a few minutes. So if anything that I presented was not clear, you know, or was not, you want to validate anything, just don't hesitate to raise any questions. You know the saying, there's no stupid questions, there's only stupid answers. So don't worry, don't hold back.
Right, exactly. Oh, I also should add that the federal government, Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, they have a variety of reports online that are all free, and they might have some that cover your product in the market that you're looking for.
Absolutely.
So Christian, would it be the USA the easiest market to start with for Canadians?
I think so. Yes, I think it's probably yes. It's a natural market. It's next door, and you know, unless there isn't any potential at all, and let's say if your product has absolutely no potential in the U.S., but there is potential in Europe, or there's potential in South America, then sure, start there. But I really think that we should begin with the US because it's so close to us, and therefore it's easy and with relatively minimal investment, so to speak. I think, yes, that's absolutely should be our choice. In spite of the current situation there that is not easy sometimes with the current administration, but it's still the easiest way to start exporting. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, Christian.
You're welcome.
Another question for you. Is it worthwhile to explore credit insurance for non-payment when you're exporting for the first time?
Yes. Well, we'll talk about it next week. Actually, it's one of our topics, and yes, it's worthwhile if you have to give credit to a client, to a new client, a potential client, and you haven't had the opportunity to check him out or check her out, taking export credit insurance from EDC, for example, or there's other organizations that provide that. I think it's a good way to start. It's worthwhile. It only covers you for 90%, I believe, and there's a cost to it, of course. But I think it's a good way to start. And then once you have had time to research the company financially, or once you've had several transactions and everything goes well, and the company is reliable and has a good credit rating, then after 5 transactions or 10 transactions, maybe you want to save a bit of cost and you don't take insurance. But even that is debatable, because things can change so fast as far as credit is concerned. So I think if you've been able to build it into your costs, so to speak, and you still can do business profitably, then I think, yes, credit insurance is a wise thing to do.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so I think everyone always appreciates, some extra time in their calendar. So we'll wrap up here.
Yep.
And I hope that everyone enjoyed the session today and learned something new. And I really hope to see everyone out for next week, same time, same place for part 2.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope we can talk next week again and exchange next week.
All right, perfect. Thank you all. Goodbye for now.
Thank you, Evan. Bye, everybody. Be safe, everybody.